Hi everyone, so in today's lesson we're going to focus on your final poem out of your unseen poems that you've been doing over the past couple of weeks, and it's called Before You Were Mine. So I know that you've already read it through with your teachers in your lesson, but we're going to read it one final time before we start annotating, and before reading I want you to focus on the lesson objective because this will help you quite a lot in your interpretation of the poem. So our lesson objective today, our learning objective, is to explore how the poet presents the strength of the bonds between parents and children. So thinking about this is about a relationship between a parent and a child before we read through one more time. Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy. I'm 10 years away from the corner you laugh on, with your pals Maggie McGeaney and Jean Duff. The three of you bend from the waist, holding each other or your knees, and shriek at the pavement. Your polka dot dress blows round your legs, Marilyn. I'm not here yet. The thought of me doesn't occur in the ballroom with the thousand eyes the fizzy movie tomorrows the right walk home could bring. I knew you would dance like that. Before you were mine, your ma stands at the close with a hiding for the late one. You reckon it's worth it. The decade ahead of my loud possessive yell was the best one, eh? I remember my hands in those high-heeled red shoes, relics, and now your ghost clatters towards me over George Square, till I see you, clear as scent, under the tree, with its lights, and whose small bites on your neck, sweetheart. Cha-cha-cha, you teach me the steps on the way home from Mass, stamping stars from the wrong pavement. Even then, I wanted the bold girl winking in Portobello, somewhere in Scotland before I was born. The glamorous love lasts where you sparkle and waltz and laugh before you were mine. So if we think about who the speaker is in the poem, we cannot always assume that the speaker is the poet, and especially with an unseen poem, we don't know a lot. We're not going to know a lot, if anything, in an exam about the poet. So what I would always say is I would refer to the person in the poem as the speaker, and not necessarily assume that it's always the poet. Now, we've got a little bit of a before we start, we've got a little bit, as you will see after reading the poem, of a structural shift between the first two stanzas and the final two stanzas. So in the first two stanzas, we're kind of reflecting on life before the child was born, and then here we've got after the child was born. So this will help you a little bit in your annotations of each quote. Now I have chosen a quote from each stanza, so we're going to focus on 4 key quotes here, and then I've got some extension quotes that I'll go through at the end if we have time, but 4 key quotes to annotate with this poem, like what you have been doing over the past couple of weeks. You've had roughly around 4 quotes per poem. So thinking about the bond between parents and children. Now in your lesson so far, you've been looking at some versatile vocabulary, so some vocabulary that you can use anywhere, across any subject, across any kind of topic in English. Now the key vocabulary that you're going to focus on today specifically is imprisoned and liberated. If we're having a look at the definition, so if someone is imprisoned, they are locked up or kept somewhere. So this doesn't have to be literally, it can also be metaphorically, so they might feel as though they are imprisoned, they might feel as though they're locked up or kept somewhere. And then, as is the case with our versatile vocabulary, we've got a contrast here. So liberated is the opposite of imprisoned. So if you describe someone as liberated, you mean that they do not accept their society's traditional values or restrictions on behaviour. So this seems like quite a difficult definition to understand, but if you just think of liberated as being sort of free, and a person who is liberated is someone who doesn't agree with tradition, so they don't go against tradition, or they don't conform to tradition, they don't conform to restrictions, and they don't conform to typical behaviour. So you've got the idea that this person is quite free and doesn't do everything that they are told, let's say. So I thought because this was your last poem, it would be really important for me to make a final note of all of the key vocabulary that you've learned in this topic so far. So if you haven't got this written down, You can screenshot this video here, or you can copy it down. I've done this in order of the lessons that you did. So this was lesson 1, this was a vocabulary, lesson 2, lesson 3, lesson 4, lesson 5, so on and so forth. So you can, if you're struggling with the definition and you want to see it put in action, you can go back to lesson 1 to see chaos and order, or lesson 2 to see vulnerable and secure, which might help you if you've forgotten. So we've got chaos, order, vulnerable, secure, rational, emotional, moral, immoral, permanent, ephemeral, tangible, intangible, volatile, constant, benevolent, malevolent, interior, exterior, internal, external, inferior to, superior to, reinforce, transgress, credulous, duplicitous, predator, prey, perpetual, intermittent, normal and abnormal. So either screenshot or make a note of them if you have forgotten them. So the very first thing that you would do in an exam, after going through your typical exam process of reading the poem 3 times, reading the question, you would then start with the title, the speaker of the poem, so you would digest who is speaking in the poem and what tone the poem is, or what tone the speaker is speaking in. So I've already said that Before You Were Mine is a little bit of a misleading title, because initially it seems as though it could be about a relationship between two people who are in love, but we know from our lesson objective that it's asking us to look at the bonds between parents and children. So we know here that we've got either a child speaking or a parent speaking, and in this case we've got a child referring to and about the parent, and they're reflecting on the parent's life before they were born and then after they were born. So thinking about what type of relationship does the title suggest will be explored in the poem. Initially what we think about here is I'm not going to repeat myself actually, what I've just said. Now, I have tried to put anything that I want you to answer in green pen so that you can see something in blue is just my comments and what I am going to talk about, but anything in green is what I want you to answer. Anything in black is a quote from the poem, and I've done an extra special bubble around it as well so you can clearly see it. So I want you to copy down Before You Were Mine, and that's the title, and I just want you to think about the type of relationship that is suggested here and what we know from what I've told you about the learning objective and what we're focusing on. And instead, if it's not about a relationship between two people who are in love with each other in a kind of husband and wife, or husband and husband, or wife and wife way, what could it suggest about how the speaker is feeling towards her mother, and what could it suggest about her ode to her mother, essentially. So we've got a speaker who, the speaker is a child speaking to and about their parent, and in this case we know that it's the mother. And I want you to think about the tone. So specifically, I'm zooming in on keywords in the title. So I've got before. I thought that was a very important keyword that I wanted to focus on, because it gives quite a reflective and nostalgic tone. So structurally, by starting the poem with the title Before, we know already that it's a flashback. We know that it's referring to things that have happened in the past, and that can already incite feelings of nostalgia and being reflective and kind of remembering what life was like beforehand. Now, thinking about what could this suggest about feelings of nostalgia for the speaker or the speaker's mother. So what are they trying to allude to? Usually, if you refer to things as before, it suggests that something has changed. So you don't usually say, oh, before yesterday, because we were still in lockdown, or because we were still in the house. You would say before lockdown or before. So it suggests straight away that something has changed. So that's really important. So I'd make a note there. Now, thinking about everything that I've just said about before, I want you to write down, what does before make you think of? So think about reflective, nostalgia. It suggests that something has changed. We see from the outset that things are going to be different in the present to what they were in the past. Okay, and then the second key word in the quote that I want to zoom in on is mine. So I've said here that it implies possessiveness. So if you refer to something as mine, it suggests that you own that and you are possessive over it, or you possess that thing or that person. So I want you to think about here, what does it mean to own something? So when I've thought of a keyword from our versatile vocabulary, or a really good keyword that I think would be useful in your answer, I've put it here in red. Think about what it means to own something, using the word control. And in turn, what does that suggest about the speaker? The speaker's impression of her mum. What does she think that she does to her mum? Could be that she thinks that she controls her. It could be that she thinks that she owns her mum. And in a way, thinking about, even though your parents are the ones who tell you what to do, their life is completely changed and completely flipped on its head when you are born. So maybe it is the truth that you control them, but don't say that to anyone's parents or carers. I wouldn't advocate saying that. So I have picked out a quote from each stanza here, and we're going to look at stanza 1, quote 1. And the quote I'm going to focus on is the very first line in the poem, "I'm 10 years away from the corner you laugh on." So just make a note of that, I'll get that written down. Now here, this is a green writing, so I want you to answer this question. So how does the speaker feel about her mother laughing? So what tone do we get at the beginning? So what impression do we get? Do you think that the speaker is looking back on her mother's life fondly? Do you think that she's feeling a little bit jealous that her mum's laughing when she's not there? Do you think that she's focusing on how different her mum's life before she was there? Just have a think about, how does the speaker feel about her mum laughing here? What impression do you get? And then question number 2, what could the corner represent? So think about the corner. It's referring here to the corner you laugh on. It's outside, it's on the pavement, it's outside of the house. She's free, and we know more so now in today's current climate that being outside is quite free, isn't it? So she's not inside her mum's house, she's outside, and we know from the next line that she's with her pals. So thinking about this keyword, liberated, what impression do we get of the mum here? And how, in turn, is the child reflecting on what her mum's life was like? So what does the corner represent? Taking the concept of the corner a little bit further with our stretch question here, if we think of the corner as external, so we've got one of our keywords here that you've looked at so far, our key vocabulary. So if we think of the corner as external and outside of the domesticated home, so that literally just means outside of the house, what could it be used to symbolise? So if we think about the home as being a secure place where you could say that you're quite imprisoned in a way, so metaphorically, if you're growing up with rules and you're living under your parents or carers' rules, you could feel quite imprisoned. So if she's outside and she's external to the domesticated home, what could this symbolise for the mother? So I'm thinking about these keywords here would be really good. So internal and external, imprisoned and liberated. So if you can get them into your response, that would be excellent. I'm going to pause here. I think this would be a good time to either answer these questions independently, or your teachers could pause and ask you some questions in the chat, or we could have a bit of a discussion about this. key quote. Okay, stanza 2, quote 2. So our second stanza, we are sticking with the fact that the child is not here yet, so that's pretty straightforward when she says, literally here, I'm not here yet. So we've still got the parent's life in the past, so we're still reflecting on the life before she had children. So the quote that we're going to focus on is, "The fizzy movie tomorrow is the right walk home could bring." It's quite a nice quote. Now, the first question that I want you to think about is what fizzes. So we would usually associate this word with what? So what would we usually associate the word fizz with if something is fizzy? Just give you a second to think about that. Now, sticking with the idea of fizzy, so the opposite of fizzy could be calm or still. Now, what does this imply about the speaker's mother's life before she had a child? So what does it imply about her life before she had a child? If the speaker is referring to her mum as her mum's life is fizzy, so she's saying the fizzy movie tomorrow, so she's talking about how tomorrow could be fizzy. And we think about what the word fizz is usually associated with. Now, what does it imply about the speaker's mother's life? So here I've not added a keyword, but I think liberated could be quite good here if you can get that into your response. And then this is still question 2. In turn, what does this imply about her mother's life after she had children? So if we've got the idea that before, so things have changed, we've got that her life before was fizzy, what could this now imply about the mother's life after she had children, or after she had the speaker in the poem? So I've got here some keywords. I'm trying to think about different words other than liberated. I've got ephemeral and permanent. So if you can get either ephemeral or permanent in your response, that would be excellent for this question. Okay, and then our stretch here for this quote. So if we focus on specifically in the quote, the right walk home could bring, because we've looked at fizzy quite a lot. If we look at the next part, the right walk home could bring. So if we think about how if she walks home in the right way, so we could maybe allude to the fact that it could be with a love interest or with some close friends. So if she walks home in the right way, what could this liberate her from? So if we refer back to the idea that the home and the domesticated space could be quite imprisoning, could be, that doesn't make sense, sorry. It could be quite a place where you might not feel liberated, especially as a teenager. You might disagree with the rules of your home. What could the right walk home liberate her from? So have a think about that, and you can look at liberate and imprison. So again, we've finished off our annotations of this quote, so I'm going to pause here, and you could have a discussion about this quote in the chat, or your teachers could have a discussion about any of these questions with you now. Okay, so I already said before that after the first 2 stanzas, we've got a structural shift. So we had before the speaker was born, and now we're kind of talking about after the speaker was born and what life was like for the mother after they were born. So we've got the structural shift in time, and then we're going to move on to stanza 3, quotation number 3 here. And that is, "My hands in those high-heeled red shoes, relics." So So here we've got the speaker is alive, the mother has had her child now, and the speaker's got her hands in the high-heeled shoes that the mother was wearing in the first two stanzas. Now, I've just thought about here that hands are typically used to take things. So if you want to take something, literally you take it with your hands, don't you? And you've got a lot of sayings about referring to taking things and alluding to hands. So if we think about that hands are typically used to take things, what does this image imply about the child? So what does this image imply about the speaker? Now, some keywords that I thought would be quite good here for this question are imprisoned and ephemeral. If we know ephemeral is something that doesn't last, so what could we say here? So the mother was having a good time with her friends, she was liberated in those high-heeled red shoes, but now the child's got her hands in them and she's kind of playing with them. So what does that suggest about the mother's life? Using the word ephemeral or imprisoned, or words, sorry. So continuing with this quote, so my hands in those high-heeled shoes, relic. So we've looked at the high-heeled shoes and we've thought about imprisoned and ephemeral and hands. Now we're going to look at relic. So a relic, and what a relic is, it literally is a historical artefact. It means that it's a historical artefact. And I thought that this was quite interesting, that we've got the idea that it's history. So if we think about the mother's life before the child, it is history, isn't it? It doesn't have to be 50 years ago to be history. You know, you could say that yesterday was history. But to the mother, because her life has changed so much, this is now a piece of history. And to the speaker, who didn't know her mother before, this is historical to her. So she thinks of this as being so far away from what she knows of her mother. So what does this also then imply about the shoes now? So if they're a historical artefact, that's usually something that we refer to about something that might be in a museum, that might be protected as remembering what life used to be like. So what does it imply about the shoes now, if they're just referred to as a historical artefact? So some key words here that I thought would be really useful for this question were, again, imprisoned, liberated, permanent and ephemeral. And then if you can, I've just got a little bit of a stretch here. I want you to think about the symbolism of these shoes and what they could symbolise. And what is this a metaphor for? So the fact that her mother's much loved shoes are now a historical artefact, what could this be a metaphor for? So just before we finish on this question, I've got a stretch here as well. So if we think about the lesson objective was the bonds between parents and children. So what tone is replied about the relationship between the parent and the child here? So if the child has the mother's key artefacts, or the shoes that she used to wear, what tone could be implied about the relationship between the mother and the child here? So I've got some key vocabulary. I've got transgress, reinforce and liberated. So think about maybe what are the mother's priorities now and how have her priorities changed. Thinking about, we alluded to the home before, didn't we? So how outside of the home could be liberated and inside of the home could be imprisoned. So I'm going to pause again now because we've finished looking at that quote, so your teachers can have a discussion with you about that quote, about some of the key questions that I've asked. Okay, and then final quote, stanza 4, quotation number 4. The quote that I've chosen here to be one of our key quotes is that glamorous love lasts where you sparkle and waltz and laugh before you were mine. So I quite liked this. I feel like throughout the poem you could question the tone of the speaker and how maybe she is reflecting on her mum's life beforehand, and maybe she feels a little bit guilty that she's changed her mum's life so much. But here she's thinking about how the mum's glamour lasts and how her love lasts for the speaker. So even though the child has changed her life, she's never felt anything but love from her parent, which I thought was quite nice. So thinking about this is quite a long question, but would you expect glamour to be permanent throughout the years? So we've got here that glamour lasts. So would you expect glamour to be permanent as the mother gets older? Would you associate glamour with getting older? And what does this suggest about the daughter's feelings towards the mother? So if she refers to the mum as glamorous and says that her glamour lasts, what impression does that give us of how the child feels about the mother? So I've got here some keywords that you could think about: permanent, liberated, and perpetual. So it's a new, I've not looked at that so far, but you've looked at that in your lessons. And question number 2 is focusing on love lasts specifically. So what does the adjective last suggest about the bond between the parent and the child? So we're thinking about our learning objective here in the final line of the final stanza. So what does the adjective suggest about the bond between the parent and child? So I've got some really good keywords here. I've got permanent, liberating, superior to, perpetual, and secure. So if we think about how this bond could be superior to anything that has happened before in the mother's life, how it's quite secure, so the child knows that regardless there's always going to be that bond, and how it's always going to be lasting. You can get some nice ideas in there. And our final one, our stretch, and I'll leave this page on so you can, because there's quite a lot of questions in this one, so I'll leave this on. Our final one, our stretch, I looked at sparkle, waltz and laugh. So what do these verbs suggest about the daughter's interpretation of the mother? So you can zoom in here to each word, so you can zoom in on sparkle, zoom in on waltz, and zoom in on laugh. And what does it suggest about how the daughter feels about her mother, about how the speaker feels about the mum? I'm thinking about the lesson objective with the bonds. And what is it the effect of ending the poem with this line? So think about our learning objective here. Think about the last impression the reader is left with. So what impression are we left about the bond between the parent and the child? And some keywords that I thought were really, really good to get into this final stretch were perpetual, liberated or liberating, permanent, secure, constant, and emotional. So I will leave this on the screen, and your teachers can go through that if they've got enough time there.